There is a photograph the palace never released, and I am glad of it because a camera would have made it small. I stood 4 paces to the left of Imrai's vein the morning he went down, close enough to hear the breath leave him and too far to catch him, and for 22 years I have told this story only to men who wore the same tunic, in the low voice we save for things the public was never meant to own. I am old now. The knees that carried me across the North Court for 3 decades are gone to gravel, and the tall bearskin that once weighed nothing weighs like a stone bucket by the second hour. So I will set it down plainly, while I still can, the way it happened and not the way the pamphlets would have shaped it, because the truth is gentler than any headline and far more worth the keeping. My name does not matter to this. Call me the old guardsman. I was young then, 26, with a spine like a mast and the arrogance of a man who has never yet been broken by anything. Imrai's was the same rank as me and 2 years older, and if you had walked the forecourt of the Palace of Eldermoor in those years, you would have picked him out without knowing why some men simply look like the idea of a thing, and Imrai's vein looked like the idea of a king's guard. Not the tallest of us, not the broadest. But there was a stillness in him that the rest of us only performed. We held our posture, he inhabited it. The tourists photographed him more than any of us, and the officers, when they wanted to show a visiting dignitary what discipline looked like in this kingdom, walked them past Imrai's post and let the man speak for himself by saying nothing. I did not like him at first. I will be honest about that, because the story is worth nothing if I dress myself up in it. I thought his composure was a kind of showing off, and I resented that the sergeant-at-arms held me to a standard set by a man who never seemed to strain. It took me a long time. It took me that morning, in fact, to understand that Imrai's was not straining, because Imrai's had already given away everything a man strains to keep for himself. And what looked like ease was only a man carrying more than the rest of us with both hands full and refusing to let it show. Let me take you to the Palace of Eldermoor as it was. You must not picture the tidy postcard. The great forecourt with the gilded railings and the crowds pressing at the black iron. Yes, that was there, and the changing of the guard drew its ribbon of tourists every morning as it does now. But behind the show face of the palace ran a second building entirely, a working machine of stone corridors and cold sculleries and stairwells that smelled of beeswax and old iron, and it was in that second palace that men like Imrai's and I lived the true half of our lives. The public saw us for 1 glittering hour. The palace had us for the other 23. That winter was the hard one. I have lived through many winters at that post, and I can still tell you which was which by the way the cold got into a particular knuckle, and that winter the cold got into all of them at once. The kingdom of Eldermoor sat under a gray lid of weather for 6 weeks without a break, a wet, bone-deep gray that never rose to the drama of snow and never sank to honest rain, just hung there and leaned on you. The stone of the forecourt sweated it. Our tunics drank it. By the 3rd week half the barracks had the cough that went around, the low rattling one that made a man's chest sound like a drawer of spoons, and the surgeon's little room off the west stair had a line outside it most mornings. King Alaric was in residence, which mattered, because when the king was in residence the guard was doubled and the hours stretched. There had been a state visit that autumn, a delegation from across the water, all sashes and interpreters, and after it the household had swelled with guests who lingered, and the swelling meant that the roster, already thin from the winter cough, was stretched past what any roster ought to bear. We were standing 4-hour posts where we should have stood 2. We were sleeping 5 hours where we should have slept 8. Nobody complained aloud, because complaining aloud was not a thing men of our tunic did, but you could read it in the barracks at night, in the way men lay down without a word and were asleep before their boots hit the floor. And into that thin, cold, overstretched winter came the small thing that this whole story turns upon, which is that there was a family living in the palace who were not, in the eyes of the great world, important at all. Princess Alara, the king's daughter by his first marriage, to the late Queen Isolde who had died when the children were small, kept her household in the east wing with her 3 children, and it is those 3 children you must hold in your mind, because they are the warm center of everything I am going to tell you. Prince Torin, 11, all elbows and questions. Prince Bram, 6, who was afraid of the dark and of the tall clock on the second landing and of very little else. And between them, 9 years old that winter, the one this story is truly about, Princess Malin. I have guarded a great many people in my life. I have stood at the shoulder of the king himself, and I have watched over foreign heads of state whose names filled the newspapers, and I have kept the door on rooms where the fate of treaties was decided by men who thought themselves the whole weight of the world. And I tell you without embarrassment that the person I remember with the most care, the one whose face comes to me first when I think of that palace, is a 9-year-old girl who barely came up to the 3rd brass button of my tunic, and who noticed things the whole grown palace walked past every day. Malin was a watcher. Torin talked and Bram clung and Malin watched. She had her late mother's gray eyes, the whole palace said so, in the careful hushed way people spoke of Queen Isolde, who was 10 years gone by then but not forgotten, whose portrait still hung in the East Gallery, and whose name still softened the king's voice on the rare days he spoke it. Malin had those eyes, and she used them. She would come down the east stair in the gray winter mornings on her way to her lessons, and she would look at each of us as she passed, not the quick and curious glance of a child who has decided the guards are furniture, but a real looking, the kind that takes a measurement. And she would say good morning, every guard by name where she knew it. Nobody had taught her to. Her governess, a stiff woman with opinions about how princesses should carry themselves past the help, had in fact tried more than once to teach her not to. It never took. Emrise's post that winter was the east colonnade, the covered stone walk that ran along the inside of the east wing, and that meant Emrise stood in Malin's path 4 mornings out of every 5. I have thought about that a great deal, how small a hinge the whole thing swung on. If the roster had put him at the north gate that month, or the Mews, none of this happens. But the roster put Emrise Vane in the east colonnade, in the path of the one child in that palace who was in the habit of truly seeing the men she passed. And so the 2 of them fell into a small daily ritual that the rest of us noticed and said nothing about. She would come down the stair. She would slow just slightly, just enough as she reached his post, and she would say, "Good morning, Corporal Vane." And Emrise, who could not by any regulation reply, who was on duty and mute as the stone behind him, would do the only thing a king's guard is permitted, which is nothing, except that with Emrise the nothing had a quality to it. His eyes stayed forward. His posture did not shift. But something in his face, some infinitesimal easing that you would have had to stand where I stood to catch, told her that the good morning had landed, that it had been heard and kept. And she, having got what she came for, would go on to her lesson satisfied. It was the smallest transaction in the world. It was also, I have come to believe, the truest friendship in that entire palace that winter, and neither of them had ever exchanged a single unregulated word. Now I must tell you about the other thing that was happening that winter, the thing under the surface, because a story of only kindness is a poem, and this is not a poem. It is a thing that happened to men. Emrise Vane was starving, and none of us knew it. I do not mean he had no food. I mean he had a family beyond the palace walls, a mother, failing, a younger brother, Denial, not right in his lungs from a childhood fever and unable to hold heavy work, and a guardsman's pay in Eldermoor that winter did not stretch to keep 2 households warm and fed and a doctor coming. So Emrise stretched it himself. He stretched it out of his own body. The barracks fed us a hard breakfast, a hot supper, bread and dripping and whatever the palace kitchen sent down, and Emrise had been quietly carrying the greater part of his own rations out through the tradesman's gate wrapped in a cloth, 4 evenings a week, to a lodging house 3 streets east where his mother coughed and his brother waited, and he had been doing it for longer than any of us guessed. He ate the crusts. He ate what could not travel. He drank the tea because tea does not keep. and he stood his 4-hour posts in the cold on that, and he did not let it show, because letting it show was not a thing he would do, and because, I understood this later, a man who has decided to give does not want to be caught at it. The giving is spoiled by the witness. So Imrise hid his kindness the way other men hide a vice, and the palace, which prided itself on discipline, mistook the discipline for strength and never looked underneath it. I noticed things without understanding them. I noticed he had gone lean in a way that was not soldier lean. I noticed he had begun, in the last hour of a long post, to have a particular way of setting his jaw, a fixed white look that I took for concentration, and was in fact a man managing the gray swim at the edges of his sight. I noticed he no longer came to the barracks card table in the evenings, and I told myself he thought himself above us, when the truth was he had somewhere to be with a cloth-wrapped parcel, and no strength to spare for cards after. The morning I want to tell you about was a Thursday, the coldest of that whole cold 6 weeks. I remember the cold specifically because the water in the horse trough by the mews had a skin of ice on it at first light, the first ice of the year, and I remember thinking as I came on duty that the day had a hard, bright edge to it that the gray weeks had lacked. The lid of cloud had lifted overnight. The sun came up thin and white and without any warmth in it at all, the kind of winter sun that lies to you about heat, and it laid long cold shadows across the forecourt and made the frost on the gilded railings burn silver. There had been a broken night before it. An alarm, near 2 in the morning, a false one, as it turned out, some fault in the new bell wires in the West Range. But a false alarm still turns every man out of his cot and into the cold courtyard to stand at ready while the officers walk the corridors. And by the time we were stood down and back in our cots, the night was mostly spent. So we came on duty that Thursday already hollow, all of us, on 4 hours broken sleep. And Imrise had come off the tradesman's gate the evening before, which meant Imrise had walked the 3 streets east and back in the killing cold after a full post, carrying his parcel, and had slept perhaps 3 hours, and had eaten, I would later learn, almost nothing in 2 days because his brother had taken a bad turn and Imrise had left even his crusts. He took the east colonnade at the 7th hour. I had the north end of the same walk, my post set so that I faced down the colonnade with Imrise at the far end of my sight line, a small red and black figure against the pale morning stone. We could not speak. We could not turn. But a guardsman learns to know his neighbor's silhouette the way you know a family member's step on the stair. And I will tell you that from the first quarter hour of that post I knew, in some animal part of me that had no words for it yet, that something was wrong with the way Imrise Vane was standing. It was too still. That sounds like nothing. Stillness was our whole trade, but there is a living stillness and there is another kind, and the difference is the thing you cannot name until you have seen the second sort, and once you have seen it you never mistake it again. A living man at attention is not truly motionless. He sways a hair's breadth with his own pulse. He shifts his weight in the invisible way we were all trained to, ounce by ounce, to keep the blood moving in the legs. Imrise was not doing that. Imrise was holding himself the way a man holds himself when moving at all has become a negotiation, when the whole of his attention has narrowed to the single task of remaining upright, and the small saving sways had been sacrificed to it one by one, until there was nothing left but the plank of him, rigid, against the stone. I could do nothing. That is the cruelty of the post, and I have carried it. I could see it coming and I could do nothing, because a king's guard does not break formation on a suspicion, does not abandon his own post to cross to another man's, does not call out. Everything I had been trained into for those years stood between me and the man I could see was in trouble, and I stood there, and I watched the small red figure at the end of the colonnade, and I willed him with everything in me to hold until the relief came at the 8th hour. He did not hold until the 8th hour. At 8:15, the east stair door opened, and Princess Malin came down for her lessons, an hour earlier than her custom because, I learned this later too. The governess had moved the schedule for some reason of her own, and so the child came into the colonnade at the exact wrong quarter hour of the exact wrong morning, and she was 30 feet from Imrai's Vane's post when he went down. I have seen men fall. In 30 years you see it all. But I had never seen a man fall the way Imrai's fell, which was without any of the flailing that the falling body usually reaches for. He did not stagger. He did not put out a hand. Whatever part of him had been holding him upright simply switched off, all at once, like a lamp, and he went straight down, the rifle clattering away across the stone, the tall bearskin rolling free, the immaculate red and black column of him folding onto the flags of the east colonnade in a way that no living man arranges himself, boneless, final. And the child screamed. Not a small scream. Malin was not a screamer by nature. She was the watching, measuring sort, the least hysterical child in that palace. But the sight of the still figure she said good morning to 4 mornings out of 5 going down like a felled thing tore a sound out of her that brought me off my post at last. Regulations be damned. Running down the colonnade with my own rifle in my hand and my heart in my throat, and brought 2 footmen out of the passage. And brought the whole cold machine of the palace's morning to a stop around the body of Corporal Imrai's Vane, lying gray and unconscious on the stone, with the thin white winter sun falling across him. That is where the palace's version of the story would have stopped, or nearly so. A guard fainted. He was carried in. He recovered. A footnote. The kind of thing that happens in a great house in a hard winter, and is written nowhere and remembered by no one. But I was there for what came after, and what came after was a 9-year-old child who did not scream and then forget, who did not let herself be led away and comforted and steered back to her lessons, but who stood in that cold colonnade over a fallen man with her mother's gray eyes gone hard as flint, and who decided something. I saw her decide it. I did not know what it was. I would not know for days. But I have thought, in all the years since, that the true beginning of this story was not the morning Imrai's Vane went down. It was the moment, 10 seconds later, when a small girl looked at the man on the stones and understood, with the terrible clean sight that children sometimes have, that this had not happened for no reason, and set her jaw exactly the way she had watched him set his, and went looking for the reason. They carried him to the surgeon's room off the west stair, 4 of us with a hand to a corner of him, and I remember how light he was. That is a thing I have never forgotten and never forgiven myself for not noticing sooner. A grown man of Imrai's frame, in full ceremonial kit, ought to be a load for 4. He was not. We carried him like a boy. And I felt it go through the others too, that wrongness in the weight of him, the 4 of us glancing at each other over the gray, slack face, and not saying the thing we were all beginning to think. The surgeon was a decent old man named Master Colwyn, gruff and unhurried and good at his work, and he cleared us out of his little room with a jerk of his head and shut the door on us, and we stood in the cold west passage and waited. The alarm had passed up the corridors by then, the way news does in a great house, running ahead of any official word, a guard down in the east colonnade. And by the time Colwyn opened his door again, there was a small crowd of us in the passage, off-duty men and footmen and a housekeeper wringing her hands, and at the front of them, where nobody had thought to send her away, stood Princess Malin. Colwyn came out wiping his hands. He looked at us, and then he looked down and found the child looking up at him, and something in the old man's face gentled. "He'll do," Colwyn said. "He's woken, he's weak, but he'll do." And then, because he was an honest man and a tired one and did not measure his words the way a courtier would, he added, half to himself, "The great fool. There's nothing wrong with him a fortnight of hot dinners wouldn't cure. He starved himself to the bone and stood a 4-hour post on it. In this cold. I've a mind to report it." I saw the words go into the child like a key into a lock. She did not say anything. She did not gasp or ask a question the way Torin would have. She simply took the fact, he has starved himself, and I watched her small face close over it and hold it, and then she turned and went quietly back down the passage the way she had come, and I thought, God forgive me, that she had gone off to be comforted and forget, because that is what children do and what children ought to do. I did not yet understand that I had just watched Princess Malin begin. They would not let me see him rise that day. He slept most of it, Colwyn said, and the next morning he was moved off the roster and into a cot in the barracks infirmary to mend, and the palace, having lost a man from an already thin roster, closed ranks over the whole and stretched us further to cover it, and the winter went on. That was how these things went. A man broke, the wall reformed around the gap. You did not speak of it, because speaking of it was a kind of weakness in itself, and because, this is the thing I most want you to understand about that world, a king's guard who could not stand his post was, in the cold arithmetic of the household, a problem to be solved and not a man to be tended. There were officers, I will not name them, who would have had Imrise quietly moved off the ceremonial roster altogether for what happened that Thursday, moved to some lesser duty in the mews or the stores where a man who might faint could do no public harm, and the mark of it would have followed him the rest of his service. A guard who fell was a guard who had failed. That was the whole of it, as far as the household cared to look. I went to see him on the third day, when I had a free hour, and I have to tell you about that visit because it is the hinge of the whole thing, the place where I stopped being a bystander to this story, and started being someone who could not put it down. The infirmary was a long, cold room, and Imrise was the only man in it, propped up on a bolster with a gray blanket to his chin, and his face the color of the blanket. He looked 10 years older than he had on Thursday morning. But his eyes were sharp when they found me. Imrise's eyes were always sharp, and there was a wariness in them, the look of a man braced to be pitied and ready to hate it. "Come to see the great fool," he said. It was the first full sentence I ever heard him speak. In 2 years standing 40 feet from the man, I had never once heard his ordinary voice, and it was lower and drier than I'd imagined, with a thread of dark humor running under it that I had not expected at all. I sat on the empty cot across from him. I did not know what to say, so I said the true thing, which was, "You gave us a fright." "I gave the child a fright," he said, and his face changed when he said it, the humor going out of it. "That is the part I can't." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the gray blanket. "She said good morning to me 4 mornings a week for a year," he said quietly, "and I paid her back by falling down in front of her like a—" He didn't finish that one either. And there, in that cold room, I got the rest of the story out of him, not because he wanted to give it, but because I was young enough and blunt enough to ask the questions a more polished man would have known to leave alone, and because I think, under the wariness, Imrise Vane had been carrying his particular weight alone for so long that some part of him was simply tired enough to set it down for 1 hour in front of one man who was not an officer. He told me about his mother. He told me about Denial and his ruined lungs. He told me, when I pressed him, and only then, about the cloth-wrapped parcels going out 4 evenings a week through the tradesman's gate, and the crusts he ate, and the 2 days before Thursday when even the crusts had gone east because his brother had taken a bad turn, and there had not been enough to send and keep both. "You could have asked for help," I said. I was angry not at him, though it came out that way, angry at the size of what he had been carrying with no one to take a corner of it. "There are funds. The chaplain, the benevolent purse the sergeant would have. And be marked the man who couldn't manage," Imrise said. "Be moved to the stores, be the guardsman who came to the household with his hand out." He shook his head once slowly against the bolster. "No. My family is my burden. I don't lay it on the crown's table." He looked at me then with something almost like an appeal, the only time I ever saw him ask anyone for anything. "You won't put it about," he said. "What I've told you, you won't make it a thing that's known." I promised him I wouldn't. And I kept that promise for 22 years, until now, until every man it could have hurt is gone and only the good of it is left to tell. But I want you to sit with what he was choosing, because it is the true center of what kind of man this was, and why what the child did mattered so much. Imrais Vane would rather have starved standing up, would rather have fallen unconscious on the stone in front of the whole palace, and taken the shame of it and the black mark and the ruin of his career, than be seen asterisk to need. His kindness to his mother and his brother was so complete that he spent his own body on it without a word, and his pride was so complete that he would not let even that kindness be known, because to have it known would have made it a claim on others, and Imrais Vane would make a claim on no one. He gave, and he hid the giving, and he would have carried it silently into the ground. That is the wall the child had to get over. And she was 9 years old, and she got over it. And she did it in a way so quiet and so exactly right that it undid a grown man and, in the end, undid me too. Because while Imrais mended in the infirmary and I stood my stretch posts, and the palace closed over the gap, Princess Malin, aged 9, was conducting an investigation. I did not know it at the time. I pieced it together afterward, from Colwyn and from the kitchen staff and from Malin's own maid and, years later, from Malin herself, when she was grown and I was old and we could finally speak of it. But this is what that child did with the fact that old Colwyn had dropped so carelessly into the West Passage. She did not go to her governess. She did not go, at first, even to her mother. She understood, and I still marvel at this in a child that age, that a grown-up told the wrong way would asterisk fix it in the grown-up way, which meant loudly, officially, with reports and inquiries, and the man in the middle of it shamed. She had watched him rise long enough to know that shame was the one thing he could not survive. So she did the thing almost no adult would have had the patience or the delicacy to do. She went quietly and found out the truth for herself before she did anything at all. She started in the kitchens. The palace kitchens were a world of their own, ruled by a head cook named Mistress Bevan, who was terrifying to everyone in the household, including, it was rumored, the king, and who had a soft spot roughly the size of a thumbnail that she guarded like a treasury. Malin went down to the kitchens. Princesses did not go down to the kitchens. It was one of 100 small rules she had a gift for not noticing, and she asked Mistress Bevan a question that stopped the whole roaring kitchen for a moment. She asked whether it was true that a guard could carry his own dinner out of the palace if he wanted to. Bevan, who missed nothing that happened to food in that building, told me years later that she had known at once what the child was really asking, because Bevan had known for months. The kitchens always know. She had watched Imrais Vane come to the tradesman's gate 4 evenings a week for his allotted supper, and take it away in a cloth instead of eating it in the hall. And she had, without a word to anyone, been quietly making his allotted supper a little larger than the regulation, the way kitchen women have kept the hungry alive since the beginning of the world, because she had guessed the shape of it even if she didn't know the names. And now here was the Princess Malin, standing in her kitchen with her mother's gray eyes, asking the question sideways, and Bevan looked at the child and made a decision of her own. She told her the truth, not all of it. Bevan didn't know all of it. But she told the child that the tall, quiet corporal from the East Colonnade took his supper away most evenings and had done for the better part of a year, and that a man who did that was a man who had a hungry mouth somewhere that wasn't his own, and that in Bevan's long experience such men were the last on earth to admit it and the first to fall down. I imagine Malin standing in that hot, loud kitchen taking it in the way she took everything in, quiet and complete, fitting the new fact against the old one from Colwyn, until the picture came clear. And I imagine the moment it came clear, because I have seen the aftermath of it on her face, and I can work backward. The moment a 9-year-old understood that the man who had said good morning back to her every day without a word, the still, strong, unbreakable man, had been quietly starving himself the whole time to feed people she had never met and would never meet, and had said nothing, and would rather have fallen down dead than let her know. I think that is the moment Malin fell in love, in the way children fall in love, which is not the way of poems but is deeper and simpler than the way of poems. She loved him the way you love a thing you have discovered to be secretly good. And a child who loves that way does not want to be thanked and does not want to be seen. She wants to fix it, and she wants to fix it the way it was hidden from her, quietly, so as not to spoil it. But she was 9. She had no money of her own worth the name. She had no power in that palace except the small, unregarded power of a middle child of a minor branch of the royal house, a girl the great world did not think about at all. Whatever she was going to do, she could not do it by decree, and she could not do it by asking a grown-up to do it for her, because the grown-ups would do it wrong. She had to do it herself, small and hidden with the little she had, and the beauty of what she found, and the thing that undoes me still, is that she understood she could not give Emrys Vane money because Emrys Vane would not take money, would sooner die than take money, had told me so himself in the infirmary. Money was a claim. Money would shame him. So she did not try to give him money. She sat with the problem, the way she sat with everything, and she found the one gift a proud man could not refuse. Now I have to leave the child for a moment, because the palace was moving too, and the palace was not moving kindly. Word of the fainting had gone up the corridors, and, as such words do, had reached the parts of the household where things were decided. And in those years the household had a particular figure in it whose hand fell on such decisions, and I must be careful how I speak of her, because she is dead now, and the dead deserve a fair account even when the account is not kind. Queen Consort Morwenna was King Alaric's second wife, married after Isolde's death, and she ran the domestic side of the household with a cold competence that no one denied and a coldness that everyone felt. She was not a cruel woman for the pleasure of it. She was worse than that, in a way that touched men like Emrys directly. She was a woman who saw the household as a machine and its people as parts of a machine, and a part that failed was to be replaced, and sentiment was a kind of rust. Morwenna heard about the fainting guard, and Morwenna decided in her clean, efficient way that a guardsman who collapsed on the ceremonial post was a liability the king's household could not carry, and she gave the order through the proper channels, all correct, all defensible, that Corporal Vane, upon his recovery, was to be removed from the ceremonial guard and reassigned to the outer stores, and that his name was to be noted against future advancement. It was not a punishment, she would have said. It was housekeeping. A man who could not be relied upon to stand could not stand at the king's door, perfectly reasonable, perfectly cold. And it would have finished Emrys Vane, not his life, but everything he was, everything the tunic meant to him, the one thing he had left after he had given away the rest of himself. A man in the outer stores does not carry parcels through the tradesman's gate to a lodging house 3 streets east, because a man in the outer stores does not earn enough to keep 2 households alive. Morwenna's tidy little order would have starved the very people Emrys had been starving himself to feed. This was the false dawn, though I did not know to call it that then. It looked, for a few days, as though the whole thing would simply resolve itself in the palace's usual gray way. A man had fainted, a man would be quietly moved, the wall would reform, and the small warm daily thing between a guardsman and a child in the east colonnade would end without anyone deciding to end it, ended by a stroke of a competent pen in a warm office by a woman who had never once said good morning to the men she passed. And here is where the 2 threads of my story reached for each other, because Princess Malin, going about her quiet investigation, learned of Morwenna's order. She learned of it from her mother. Princess Ilara, Malin's mother, the king's daughter, was not a woman of great power in that household either. She had lost her own mother young. She stood a little in the shadow of her father's second marriage, and she had learned to move softly in a house that was no longer quite hers. But she loved her children fiercely, and she was not a fool, and when her middle daughter came to her, as Malin finally did, once she had the whole shape of it and laid out in her quiet exact way everything she had learned, Ilara listened, and her face changed, and she understood 2 things at once. She understood that a good man was about to be quietly destroyed for the crime of having given too much. And she understood that her 9-year-old daughter had already worked out how to save him, and had come not to be talked out of it, but to ask for the one piece she could not supply herself. I know how that conversation went because Alara told me long after, on an autumn afternoon when Malin was grown and gone from the palace, and her mother sat with an old guardsman and remembered. She told me that Malin came to her room in the evening, after the household had settled, and stood very straight and said she needed to ask a grown-up thing, and would her mother please not fix it the grown-up way. And Alara, who knew her daughter, promised. And Malin told her everything, Colwyn's words, Bevan's words, the parcels, the mother, the brother. And then she said the thing that Alara said she would remember on her own deathbed, which was, "He gives everything away and hides it so nobody can thank him. So the gift has to be one he can't give back. And it can't have my name on it, because if it has my name on it he'll try to give it back to *me*, and he'll be ashamed, and it'll be spoiled." Alara said she looked at her 9-year-old and felt the ground move a little, because the child had understood something about the shape of pride and the shape of grace that most people go their whole lives without seeing. And she asked Malin what the gift was going to be. And Malin told her. And Alara, she said, had to turn to the window for a moment before she could answer, because it was so simple and so exactly right that it took her breath. "I will not tell you yet what the gift was. Forgive me the withholding. I am an old man and I have earned the right to tell a story in its own order. And the truth is that the gift is the heart of the thing, and I want you to arrive at it the way I did, from underneath, having first understood everything it had to overcome. But I will tell you that it required 3 things Malin did not have, and that this is where her mother came in. It required a small amount of money, not much, but more than a child saved coins. It required a hand inside the workings of the palace that could arrange a thing without it being traced back to the East Wing. And it required, above all, that Morwenna's order be stopped, that Imrai's vein be kept on the ceremonial guard, be kept in the East Colonnade, be kept in the one place where the gift could do its work, because the gift was worth nothing if the man was sent to the stores, and the small daily mourning between them was ended. And so this became not one child's secret errand but a small, quiet conspiracy of the powerless, a 9-year-old girl, her soft-spoken mother, a terrifying head cook, a gruff old surgeon, and before it was done, one young guardsman who could not stand aside, moving in the low corridors of that palace against a cold order from a warm office, to save a man who would have forbidden every one of them from lifting a finger if he had known. Alara could not fight Morwenna directly. That much was clear to both of them. Morwenna held the domestic household and Alara did not, and an open appeal, "Please do not move this guard," would have gone nowhere, or worse, would have drawn Morwenna's cold attention to exactly the man they were trying to protect, and to the reason, and the reason was the very thing that damned him in Morwenna's arithmetic. No, the order could not be fought in the open. It had to be gone over. It had to be taken to the one person in that palace whose word outweighed the queen consort's on such a matter, and who might be moved to spend that word on a single guardsman if the thing were put to him rightly. It had to go to the king. And you do not simply walk up to King Alaric and ask him to overrule his wife over a fainting corporal. Not in that household, not in that winter. There was a wall of custom and office and careful people between the king and any such small human matter, and Morwenna herself sat squarely in the middle of that wall. To reach Alaric with this, past Morwenna, in a way that would move him and not merely annoy him, that was a harder thing than any of Malin's kitchen questions, and it is the point at which the child's quiet plan needed, for the first time, more than quiet. It needed a moment. The right moment in front of the right man, arranged so that the truth could not be tidied away before it landed. And arranging that moment, without Malin's name on it and without Imrai's knowledge and against the grain of the whole careful household, was the thing that nearly broke the whole enterprise, And the thing that finally pulled me, the old guardsman, the bystander, the man who had promised to keep a secret and thought that was the end of his part, off the sidelines and into the middle of it, where I have been in my heart ever since. They came to me on the 6th day. Not Malin, a princess of 9, did not summon a guardsman to her presence, and even had she wanted to, the whole point was that her hand must not show. It was Alara who found me, and she found me cleverly in a way that would raise no eyebrow. She requested, through the ordinary channels, that the guardsman who had been on the north end of the east colonnade the morning of the incident attend her to give an account of what he had seen, which was a perfectly natural thing for the fallen man's own princess to want, and no one thought a thing of it. I stood in Princess Alara's sitting room with my bearskin under my arm and gave my account, and when I had given it, the too still silhouette, the way he had gone straight down, the child's scream, Alara was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me a question that was not about the morning at all. She asked me whether it was true, as she had heard, that Corporal Vane and I were friends. I said we were not, or had not been, and that I was ashamed of it, and that I would call myself his friend now if he would have it, and that I would do a great deal to see him not sent to the stores. I did not know, saying it, that I was walking straight into the middle of the child's plan. But Alara heard what she needed to hear, and she looked at me for a long moment, taking my measure the way her daughter took the measure of the guards on the stair, and then she did something that no princess of that household would ordinarily do with a corporal of the guard, which was that she trusted me. She told me the whole of it. Colwyn Bevan, the parcels, the mother, the brother, Morwenna's order, and Malin and the gift, and the moment they needed and could not make. I am telling you this, Alara said, because my daughter has decided that a good man is not going to be destroyed for his goodness, and she is right, and I cannot do it alone, and you were there and you carried him, and I think you felt how light he was. I had felt it, God help me, I have felt it every day since. What do you need? I said, not a question. I had already crossed over. I think I crossed over in the infirmary truly, but that was the moment I knew it. What they needed was this. Morwenna's reassignment order was not yet final. It awaited the king's countersignature, a formality, the kind of routine domestic paper that Alaric signed by the fistful without reading, on the advice of the queen consort who prepared it. Once he signed, Emrys was gone to the stores and the thing was done and no gift on earth could reach him there. So the paper had to be stopped before the king's pen touched it, and more than stopped, it had to be turned around, because merely delaying it would only mean Morwenna sent it up again. The king had to be made to *care*, personally, about one corporal of his guard, enough to strike the order himself and keep the man where he was. And he had to be made to care in a way that did not run through Morwenna, and could not be intercepted and smoothed away by the careful people around him before it reached him. And the child had thought of the way, of course she had. She was the one who had thought of everything. There was, in that palace, one door the queen consort's efficiency did not reach behind, and it was the door of the king's grief. Alaric had loved Isolde, the whole household knew it, in the way you know a thing that is never spoken, and though he had married again for reasons of state and household, and had done his duty by that marriage, there was a part of the man that had gone into the ground with his first wife and stayed there, and everyone who served him learned early to step softly near it. Once a week on the same evening, the king went alone to the east gallery where Isolde's portraits hung, and he sat there a while, and no one disturbed him, and Morwenna herself did not go with him. It was the 1 hour of the man's week that belonged to no one but himself. The East Gallery. At the end of the East Colonnade, the very walk where Emrys Vane stood his post and where he had fallen. Malin had seen it, of course she had seen it. She saw everything on that stair, that on the evenings her grandfather by marriage went to sit with her own dead grandmother's portraits. He passed down the East Colonnade, past the guards, alone. In the 1 hour he was not surrounded by the household's careful wall. And she had understood that if there was a single place and hour in that whole palace where the truth about Imrai's vein could be laid before the king directly, past Morwenna, in a way he would receive with his heart open and not his office closed, it was there, on that walk on that evening, when the man was already softened by his own grief, and remembering what it was to lose someone you would have given your body to keep. The plan was not complicated. That was its genius. There would be no speeches, no petition, no dramatic appeal that the careful people could tidy away. On the king's grief evening, Imrai's vein, recovered now, back on his feet, but not yet reassigned because the paper was being quietly held up in the works by a friendly clerk Bevan knew, would be placed back on his old post in the east colonnade. Just placed there, standing, doing nothing, saying nothing as he had always done. And the king, walking his slow grief walk to his dead wife's portraits, would pass the guard he had signed away without reading the paper, and would not know him from any other guard, and would go on to the gallery. Except that this time, someone would make sure the king knew. And that someone could not be Malin, whose hand must not show, and it could not be Alara, whose open involvement would draw Morwenna's eye. And it could not be Colwyn or Bevan, who had no business speaking to the king at all. It had to be someone with a natural reason to be on that walk, in that hour, close to the king, whose word about a guardsman would carry the weight of a fellow guardsman's. Someone the king might actually stop and listen to on the subject of one of his own. It had to be me. I want to be honest about how frightened I was. We did not speak to the king. It was not done. A corporal of the guard who opened his mouth to King Alaric unbidden, on a private evening, in his hour of grief, about a matter of the household that the queen consort had already decided. That was a corporal who could be broken to the ranks or turned out of the guard entirely, and would deserve it by every rule I had lived by for 2 years. Everything I was trained into stood against it, exactly as everything had stood against my leaving my post to run to Imrai's on the stone. And I found, standing in Alara's sitting room with the whole weight of the plan settling onto my shoulders, that I did not care. Or rather, that I cared, that the fear was real and stayed real, and that there was a thing that outweighed it. And the thing that outweighed it was the memory of how light Imrai's vein had been when we carried him, and the memory of a child screaming in a cold colonnade, and the plain, unbearable wrongness of a man being destroyed for the crime of loving his family more than himself. "I'll do it," I said. Alara looked at me, and I saw in her face that she had known I would, and that her daughter had known too, that I had been, all along, a piece of the child's design that the child had never met, slotted into place by a 9-year-old who understood men better than most men understand themselves. There was one more piece, and it was Malin's own, and it was the piece I have never been able to speak of without my voice going, even now, even as an old man who has said it aloud to other old men 100 times. The gift. Because the plan I have described to you, reaching the king, stopping the order, keeping Imrai's on his post, that was only the frame. That was only the getting of Imrai's to safety. It saved his career and it saved his family's bread, and it was a great deal. And if that had been the whole of it, I would still be telling you the story of a good child and a good mother who saved a good man from a cold order. But it was not the whole of it. It was not even, to Malin, the point. The stopping of Morwenna's order was, to her, merely the clearing away of the obstacle. The gift itself, the real thing, the thing she had decided upon in the first 10 seconds standing over him on the stone, was something else entirely, something so quiet and so exactly shaped to the man that, when I finally understood it, I had to step out of the room where I understood it and stand in a cold passage for a while by myself. She had asked her mother for 3 things, remember: a little money, a hand in the workings of the palace, and the stopping of the order, and I have told you what the money and the hand and the order were for the frame of it. But the money, the little money, a child's ransom scraped from a mother's purse, went to a specific thing, a small and particular thing, and it is that small particular thing that this whole long story has been walking toward, and I am nearly ready now to set it down. But first the king. First the evening in the east colonnade, when a fallen guard stood his post again, and an old man walked to his dead wife's pictures, and a frightened corporal opened his mouth to say a thing he could be ruined for saying, and a 9-year-old girl watched from the top of the east stair, hidden, holding her breath, to see whether the world could be made, just once, quietly, to be kind. It was a Friday evening, near the end of that hard winter, and the cold had gone still and clear the way it does before the turn of the year. The east colonnade was lit by the wall lamps, small pools of warm light along the cold stone, and Imrais Vane stood at his old post as if he had never left it, recovered enough now, filled out a little from a fortnight of Bevan's overlarge suppers that he had been made, by a friendly quartermaster's ruling he did not question, to eat in the hall under a watchful eye rather than carry away. He did not know why he had not been sent to the stores. He did not know the paper was being held. He knew only that he was back on his post, mended, grateful in the closed private way of his, and standing his watch. He did not know I was going to be there at the far end of the walk, on a duty I had quietly arranged to trade for. He did not know anything. I took the north end of the colonnade at the 9th hour, the same sight line I'd had the morning he fell, the small red and black figure of him at the far end against the lamplit stone. And we waited, the two of us, 40 feet apart and mute as we had always been, for an old man to come walking to his grief. The king came at 9:30, as he came every Friday. He was alone, as he always was on that walk, no equerry, no attendant, only the 2 guards on the colonnade, whom he had passed 1,000 times and never truly seen. He was not in his robes. He was a tall, stooped man in a plain, dark coat, older than his years that winter, walking slowly with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the stone ahead of him, going to sit with the pictures of the wife he had buried. And there was nothing of the king about him at all in that hour except the way the whole palace arranged itself to leave him alone in it. He passed Imrais first. Imrais, at attention, eyes forward, gave him nothing as the post required. The king's own guard does not gape at the king. Alaric did not look at him. Why would he? He walked on down the lamplit colonnade toward the gallery door, toward me, toward the end of the walk, and I felt my heart going like a drum and every rule of my 2 years' service rising up in my throat to stop my mouth. And I thought, he is going to pass me and be gone, and the moment will be lost, and Imrais will go to the stores after all, and I will have failed a child. And then I did the thing I can be broken for, and I have never once regretted it. As the king drew level with my post, I said, quietly, in the low, even voice we save for the king, not breaking my posture, my eyes forward as they had to be, "Your Majesty, forgive me." He stopped. A king is not spoken to by a corporal of his guard. It does not happen. And so the very fact of it, the impossibility of it, the sheer breach, did what no petition through the proper channels could ever have done. It cut clean through the old man's grief fog and turned him, slowly, to look at me. And his eyes, when they found my face, were not angry, only tired and a little astonished. The eyes of a man so unused to being addressed by the furniture of his own palace that he could not at first make sense of it. "You have something to say to me, guardsman," he said. It was not quite a question. There was a warning under it, but there was also, and I have thanked God for this every day since, there was also curiosity, the flicker of a man who has been walled off so long from anything unarranged that a corporal breaking every rule to speak to him was, in its way, the most human thing that had happened to him in a month. "I do, Your Majesty," I said. "And I know what it costs me to say it, and I say it anyway, because there is a wrong about to be done in your house that you would not permit if you knew of it, and no one is going to tell you but me." I felt rather than saw Imrais stiffen at the far end of the walk. He could hear. He did not yet understand, but he could hear that his neighbor on the post had gone mad and was speaking to the king, and I could feel the horror coming off him down 40 feet of cold stone. "Go on," said Alaric. And I told him. I did not tell him cleverly. I had rehearsed 100 careful versions, and in the moment I threw them all away and told him the plain thing, the way Emrise had told me in the infirmary, because the plain thing was the only thing worth the risk. I told him there was a man on his guard, that man there at the end of the walk, who had for the better part of a year been carrying his own dinner out of the palace to feed a failing mother and a sick brother, and eating the crusts, and standing his 4-hour posts on nothing, and had said no word of it to anyone because he would rather have starved than be seen to need. I told him the man had fainted on this very stone a fortnight past, in front of the man's own granddaughter. I did not name her, I only said a child of the household, and that a child had seen it and been frightened by it. And I told him here I risked everything, because here I named the thing Morwenna had done, and Morwenna was the king's wife, that an order had been prepared to remove this man from the guard for the crime of having fallen, and to send him to the stores where he could not earn enough to keep the very people he had been starving himself to feed, and that the order awaited only His Majesty's signature, given as such papers were always given, without reading. And I could not stand at my post and let you sign it unknowing, I said, and let a good man be destroyed for the one thing in him that is best. So I have spoken, and I will take whatever comes of my speaking. The king was silent for a long time. The cold lamplit colonnade held its breath. Down at the far end, Emrise Vane stood rigid, and I knew without looking that the man was in agony, that his secret, the thing he had guarded more fiercely than his life, was being laid bare before the king in the open air, and that some part of him would rather I had let him go to the stores in silence than have this said aloud. Then Alaric turned and walked slowly, back down the colonnade to Emrise's post, and stood in front of him and looked at him. And Emrise, who had held his composure through the fainting and the infirmary and the fortnight of not knowing his fate, held it now too, eyes forward, giving the king nothing, standing his post while his heart was surely breaking, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with a thing too large to bear. He stood at attention inside it. "Is it true," the king asked him quietly, "what your comrade says of you?" A guard does not answer the king on his post, but the king had asked, and so Emrise was permitted, and I heard his voice come down the cold stone, low and even and stripped bare. "The part about my family is true, your majesty," he said. "The rest is my comrade's kindness. I ask only to keep my post. I ask nothing else. I have never asked anything else." And the king of Eldermoor stood in front of one corporal of his guard on a cold Friday evening in the last week of a hard winter, on his way to sit with his dead wife's pictures, and I watched something move in the old man's face that I do not think the household had seen move there in years. Because Alaric, who had loved a woman and lost her, and who knew, better than any man in that palace, what it was to have someone you would have spent your whole body to keep. Alaric was looking at a man who had spent his whole body to keep the ones he loved, quietly, asking nothing. And I think in that moment the king saw in Emrise Vane not a failed guardsman, but the thing he himself had loved most in Isolde and lost. The plain, unpurchasable goodness that the whole machine of a royal household is built to grind down, and never once knows how to honor. "You will keep your post," the king said. "The order is struck, it will not be signed." And then, in a voice so low I barely caught it, more to himself than to Emrise, he said, "There is not enough of this in my house. God knows there is not enough of it." He stood there a moment longer. Then he did a thing I have never told anyone until now, a thing that was not in any plan and that no one arranged. He reached out and very briefly laid his hand on Emrise Vane's shoulder, the king's own hand, on a corporal's red wool, in the cold and the lamplight, the way a father lays a hand on a son, or a man lays a hand on another man he has recognized as worth more than himself. Emrise stood at attention under it and did not move, and I saw, at the far end of the walk, that the still strong, unbreakable man had at last begun, silently, to weep, the tears just running down his forward-facing composure without his permission, because there are some things that even the greatest discipline in the world cannot hold against. Then the king took his hand away and walked on, alone, down the colonnade and through the gallery door to sit with his pictures. And the plan had worked. Imrise was saved. The order was dead. His post was his family's bread was safe, and the child at the top of the east stair. I did not know she was there, but she was, hidden in the shadow of the landing, watching every moment of it with her mother's gray eyes, had made the world be kind, just once quietly, without her name on any of it. That would have been enough. If the story ended there, it would be enough, and more than most men get. But it does not end there, because I have not yet told you about the gift. 3 mornings later, Imrise Vane came on duty in the east colonnade and found, waiting at his post, a small parcel. There was no name on it. There was no card, no crest, no mark of the east wing or any wing. It was wrapped in a plain cloth of the sort the kitchens used, tied with ordinary twine, and it had been left where he could not miss it and no one had seen it placed. And inside it, Imrise told me this himself, years later, in a voice I had to lean in to hear, inside it were 2 things. The first was food, but not food for him. That was the thing that broke him, the thing that told him at once that whoever had done this had understood him all the way to the bottom. It was not a rich man's basket sent down to a hungry guard, which he would have been ashamed of and would have tried to refuse. It was a parcel got up exactly the way he got up his own parcels, plain, portable, the kind of good simple food that would travel 3 streets east and keep, bread and hard cheese and dried fruit, and a twist of tea, and a little jar of the beef, broth the surgeon had ordered for his brother's lungs. It was a parcel meant to go out the tradesman's gate, not to be eaten in the hall. Someone had made him a gift not of relief from his burden but of help carrying it, had said, without a word, without a name, "I know what you do, and I will not shame you by making you stop. I will only make it lighter." And there was a second such parcel promised. The cloth held a slip that said only, and 1 each week, for as long as they need it, in a careful round child's hand that Imrise did not recognize, and I did. That was the money. That was the little ransom scraped from Alara's purse. It did not go to Imrise. Malin had understood this is the thing, this is the whole of the thing, that you cannot give a man like Imrise Vane a gift for himself because he will give it away or refuse it or be shamed by it. So she gave him a gift for the people he loved. She made herself, secretly, a partner in his own hidden kindness. She could not lift his burden off him. He would never have permitted it. So she quietly slipped her small shoulder under the other end of it, in the dark, where he could not see her to thank her or refuse her, and she carried it beside him for as long as it needed carrying. And the second thing in the parcel was smaller still, and it is the thing I cannot say without stopping. It was a drawing, a child's drawing in ink and a little color, done with great care on a good piece of paper, the one thing in the parcel that a child's few coins had actually bought, the paper and the good ink. It showed the east colonnade. It showed the lamps and the cold stone, and it showed a guard, tall and red and black, standing his post, but the guard in the drawing was not alone. Around him, drawn small, were 3 figures the child had put there, an old woman with a shawl and a thin young man, and holding the guard's white-gloved hand, a small girl who was not quite touching the ground, as though she had drawn herself lifting a little of his weight. And under it, in the same careful round hand, she had written the only words in the whole gift, and they were not "thank you," and they were not her name. They were 4 words, and they were these: "You are not alone." That is the gift. That is the whole of what a 9-year-old girl gave to a fainting royal guard in the coldest week of a hard winter, and it is the thing the media, as the modern word has it, never told, because there was nothing in it for the media to tell, no scandal, no spectacle, no crime, no name to print. Only a child who saw a good man drowning quietly, and instead of raising an alarm that would have shamed him, slipped silently into the water beside him and helped him swim. Only kindness answered with kindness, in the dark, without credit. The kind of thing that happens in the low corridors of great houses and is written nowhere, and would be lost entirely if an old guardsman did not, at the end of his life, finally set it down. Imrai's Vane kept that drawing for the rest of his life. He carried it, I happen to know, folded in a small oilcloth in the breast of his tunic for the remaining 18 years of his service over his heart under the medals, where the regulations knew nothing of it. When his mother died the following spring, warm and fed and easy at the last, that drawing was in his tunic. When his brother Denial, against every expectation, mended enough in the years that followed to hold a light trade and marry and give Imrais a nephew, that drawing was in his tunic. And when Imrais himself came at last to the end of his post, an old sergeant by then, gone silver, and stood his final watch in the east colonnade before he laid down the tunic for good, that folded, worn, four-word drawing was where it had always been over his heart, and he took it out and looked at it that last morning, and then he put it back and stood his watch. He never learned her name for it, not for a long time. That was Malin's own condition, held to fiercely, that Imrais must never be told it was her, because if he were told it was her, he would try, in his proud, broken, beautiful way, to give it back, to balance the account, to refuse to be in a child's debt. So she kept her name off it, and off the parcels that came every week for as long as his family needed them, and off the whole of it, and she let a good man believe for years that the palace itself, or God, or simple luck, had reached down and helped him carry his family, because she had understood at 9 years old that the highest form of a gift is the one the giver hides so that the receiver may keep his pride and his gratitude both, and owe nothing, and only be lighter. She told him at the end, "I will give you that because you have come this far and you deserve the warm close of it." Years later, when Malin was grown and Imrais was old and near his retirement, she came to him one last time in the east colonnade, a young woman now, with her mother's gray eyes and her dead grandmother's grace, and she stood where she had stood as a child and said, "Good morning, Sergeant Vane," the way she had said it 1,000 mornings when she was small. And Imrais, off duty that day, permitted to speak, looked at her for a long moment, and something in his old face understood at last what he had never let himself guess, and his eyes filled. And he took the worn drawing out from over his heart, where it had lived for 18 years, and he held it out to show her he had kept it, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying that the drawing had not already said. You are not alone. She had made it true. That was the gift, not the food, though the food kept his family alive, not the stopping of the order, though that saved his post. The gift was that a man who had built his whole life on the principle that he must carry everything himself and lay his burden on no one, a man who would have gone into the ground sooner than let another soul take a corner of his weight, was quietly, secretly, without ever being asked to surrender his pride, taught the one thing his goodness had never let him learn, that he was not, in fact, alone, that his kindness had been seen. That in the coldest corner of a cold winter a child had looked at him and decided he was worth saving, and had saved him, and had asked nothing back. I am old now, as I said at the start. Most of them are gone. The king is long dead, and so is Isolde's memory that he went weekly to sit with, and so is Morwenna, whose cold tidy order was struck by a grief-softened king on a Friday evening and never signed. Ilara is gone. Bevan and Colwyn are gone. Imrais Vane is gone. He lived a good long while after his service, warm and unhurried with his brother's family close about him, and he died in his own bed with the drawing in a frame on the wall where he could see it, and I was there, and it was gentle. Only I am left of that night in the colonnade, and Malin, who is gray herself now, and who does good quiet work in the world that has her name on none of it, exactly as you would expect of the girl she was. I broke my promise to Imrais to tell you this. I said I would never make his need a thing that was known, and for 22 years I kept it, and now I have broken it, and I think he would forgive me, because the thing I have made known is not his need. His need is the smallest part of it, and it is long since answered. The thing I have made known is what was done about his need, quietly, without credit, by a child who understood grace better than the whole grand household understood it. And that is a thing the world could stand to hear, in a hard winter, when the cost of goodness runs high and no one seems to be watching. The media never told it. There was nothing in it for them. But it happened. I stood 4 paces to the left of it, and I have carried it my whole life, and now I have set it down. A guard fell in the cold, and a small girl caught him, not on the stone, where I could not reach him, but underneath, where it counted. She caught him with 4 words in a plain cloth parcel, and a hand slipped secretly under the far end of his burden, and she never once let him see her do it, and he carried her 4 words over his heart for 18 years, and that is the whole of the story, and it is enough. Good morning, Corporal Vane. Wherever you are standing your watch now, good morning. You were never alone, she made sure of it, and so, in the end, did we all.